The grand hall of Velthera's royal palace shimmered under the glow of floating crystal lamps. It was a place of power, tradition, and ancient customs. Tonight, the hall was filled with diplomats from across the stars, gathered for a crucial peace negotiation between Velthera and the humans. Among them was Captain Daniel Carter, a representative from Earth, standing among the towering alien nobles. Daniel, dressed in a formal human uniform, kept his posture straight and his face calm, but inside, he felt the weight of every gaze upon him. The Veltharians were taller, their skin in shades of deep blue and violet, their golden eyes glowing with an air of superiority. They saw humans as a young race, too emotional, too unpredictable. Yet here they were, trying to form an alliance with Earth. From the raised throne, King Zorith, ruler of Velthera, watched in silence. His presence alone made the hall feel heavier. At his side stood Princess Soraya, his only daughter, dressed in a regal silver gown. Unlike the others, her eyes weren't filled with cold judgment. They held curiosity. As the discussions began, tensions quickly rose. The Veltharians wanted control over certain trade routes in space, but the human delegation refused to give them full power. The room buzzed with heated debates, but Daniel stayed calm, choosing his words carefully. The strength of an alliance, Daniel said, voice firm, doesn't come from control, but from trust. If Velthera and Earth are to stand together, we must treat each other as equals, not rulers and servants. A murmur spread across the room. The Veltharian nobles exchanged looks, some offended, others amused. One of the elder Veltharians scoffed. Humans speak of equality, yet they know nothing of our ways. Our kingdom has stood for centuries. We do not change for the weak. Daniel didn't flinch. Humans may not be the strongest or the oldest, but we survive. We fight, we adapt, and we never back down. A small smile touched Soraya's lips as she listened. His words were bold, different from the careful flattery she was used to hearing in the palace. The meeting ended with no clear decision, but Soraya couldn't stop thinking about the humans' words. That night, while the diplomats returned to their quarters, she made a risky decision. A secret meeting. The royal gardens were silent, bathed in the silver light of Velthera's twin moons. Flowers with glowing petals lined the pathways, their soft hum the only sound in the air. Daniel stood near a small fountain, looking at the alien sky, lost in thought. He had expected hostility, but something about the way Soraya had watched him during the meeting had felt different. You speak boldly for a human. He turned sharply. Soraya stood a few steps away, her elegant gown barely making the sound as she moved. Daniel straightened, his military instincts kicking in. I speak the truth, he replied. Soraya tilted her head. And you truly believe humans and Veltharians can be equals? Daniel studied her for a moment. Her golden eyes, so much like her father's, were filled not with arrogance, but with something else. Curiosity, perhaps even doubt. I do, he said. But it's not just about species. It's about individuals. People should be free to choose their own path. Soraya let out a soft breath. That is not how my world works. Here, duty is everything. My father has already chosen my future, my marriage, my role, my fate. It has all been decided. Daniel frowned. And you're okay with that? Her gaze lowered slightly. I have never questioned it before. A silence stretched between them, filled only by the gentle whisper of the wind. Then Daniel chuckled. You know, on Earth, we have stories about princesses locked in towers, waiting for heroes to save them. But I don't think you're the type who needs saving. Soraya smiled, amused. And what makes you think that? Because you're here, Daniel said simply, talking to me, the human, against your father's rules. She laughed softly. You are interesting, Captain Daniel Carter. So are you, Princess Soraya. For the first time in her life, Soraya felt seen, not as a royal, not as a daughter bound by duty, but as a person. And in that moment, she wondered, Was it truly wrong to want more than the life chosen for her? The shadows watch. Unbeknownst to them, hidden in the darkness of the garden, a pair of watchful eyes observed their exchange. A royal guard, one of the king's loyal men, slipped away silently into the night, ready to report to his master. And King Zoreth did not tolerate disobedience. The palace halls were quiet, but Soraya's mind was restless. She had spent the entire night thinking about Daniel Carter and his words. For the first time, someone had made her question everything she had been taught. Was her fate truly sealed? Did she really have no choice but to obey her father's will? As the first light of Velthera's twin suns touched the city, Soraya stood on her balcony, looking over the vast kingdom. It was a magnificent world, one she was expected to rule beside a man she did not love. A life without choice, without freedom. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at her door. "Enter," she said, turning. Her personal maid, Talia, stepped inside, eyes filled with worry. She was more than a servant, she was a friend. "The king knows," Talia whispered urgently. Soraya's heart skipped a beat. "Knows what?" "About the human," Talia said. "Someone saw you in the garden last night. The guards are watching him." Soraya's stomach tightened. She had known speaking to Daniel was risky, but she hadn't expected her father to react so quickly. "What will he do?" she asked, her voice calm, though inside she felt uneasy. Talia hesitated before answering. "If he believes the human is a threat, he may order his removal." Soraya clenched her fists. She knew what that meant. Her father did not take chances. If he saw Daniel as a danger, he wouldn't just send him away. He would have him eliminated. She had to warn him. A risky meeting. Daniel Carter sat on the balcony of the human delegation's quarters, drinking a cup of something that barely resembled coffee. It wasn't Earth's finest, but it was warm, and after the long diplomatic meetings, he needed it. He stared at the sunrise over the alien city, appreciating the beauty of it. Velthera was an advanced world, rich in culture and history, but behind its elegant surface, Daniel sensed rigid control. Everything ran on order, duty, and tradition. There was little room for change. A soft rustle behind him made him turn. Soraya stood there, her silver gown shimmering softly in the morning light. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Didn't expect a princess to sneak into my quarters." "I had no choice," Soraya said quickly, stepping forward. "You're in danger." Daniel's relaxed posture changed. "What kind of danger?" "My father is watching you," Soraya said, lowering her voice. "Someone saw us last night. If he thinks you are a threat, he will act." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I figure I wasn't making many friends around here." Soraya hesitated before speaking again. "You should leave." Daniel looked at her carefully. "And you? What will happen to you?" Soraya glanced away. "I will be fine." Daniel wasn't convinced. "You don't believe that." She swallowed hard. "My father has already chosen my husband, a warlord named Corin. He is powerful, respected, and loyal to the kingdom." Daniel's jaw tightened. "And do you want to marry him?" Soraya's silence was answer enough. Daniel exhaled. "So your father decides everything for you?" She nodded. "Yes, that is our way." He studied her for a moment before shaking his head. "That's not a way, Soraya. That's a prison." Soraya felt something stir inside her at his words. Was it true? Had she been nothing more than a prisoner in golden chains? Before she could say anything, a voice rang through the halls outside. "The king summons Princess Soraya at once." Soraya stiffened. Daniel stood. "That doesn't sound good." She turned to leave but paused. "Promise me, Daniel. If things turn dangerous, you will leave Velthera." Daniel smirked slightly. "Can't make that promise, princess." Soraya frowned. "Why?" His eyes met hers. "Because I don't run from a fight." Her heart skipped again. But this time, it wasn't out of fear. The king's warning. Soraya stood before King Zoreth in the great throne room. His golden eyes burned with silent fury. "You were seen speaking to the human," he said. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a storm. Soraya kept her expression neutral. "He is an ambassador. It is natural to speak with guests." Zorath's fist clenched against the armrest of his throne. "You are not a diplomat. You are my daughter." Soraya remained silent. The king stood, stepping closer. "Listen to me, Soraya. You will not speak to the human again. You are promised to Warlord Koren. That is final." Soraya met her father's gaze, and for the first time, she felt something new inside her. Defiance. "What if I do not wish to marry him?" she asked, her voice steady. A tense silence fell over the room. Even the guards shifted uneasily. Zorath's eyes darkened. "Then you will no longer be my daughter." Soraya felt a sharp sting in her chest, but she refused to look away. Her father exhaled, as if trying to control his temper. "You will marry Koren. You will fulfill your duty. This conversation is over." Soraya lowered her gaze, hiding her thoughts. "As you wish, father." She turned and walked away, her face expressionless. But deep inside, something had changed. For the first time in her life, she realized she had a choice, and she would make it. The great halls of Velthera's palace felt colder than ever. Princess Soraya walked through the long corridors, her mind racing. Her father's words echoed in her head. "You will marry Koren. You will fulfill your duty." But could she? Her heart felt heavy, yet for the first time in her life, she felt awake. Meeting Daniel Carter, hearing his words about freedom and choice, had opened her eyes to something she had never considered before, a life where she was in control of her own destiny. She knew the risks. If she disobeyed, she would lose everything: her title, her home, her people. Her father would never forgive her. And yet, deep inside, she also knew something else. She could not go back to the way things were. A visitor in the night. Late that night, as Soraya sat on the edge of her balcony, lost in thought, a voice whispered from the shadows. "You look troubled, princess." Soraya turned sharply, but instead of a guard, she saw a familiar face, Daniel Carter. Her eyes widened. "What are you doing here?" she whispered. "If my father finds you." Daniel smirked slightly. "I figured I should check on you before that happens." Soraya sighed. "You shouldn't have come." Daniel crossed his arms. "And yet, here I am." She shook her head. "You don't understand. My father has already decided my fate. If I refuse, I will be disowned." Daniel studied her for a long moment. "And what do you want?" Soraya hesitated. "I don't know." Daniel took a step closer. "Yes, you do." Soraya met his gaze, and for the first time, she allowed herself to say the truth out loud. "I don't want to marry Koren," she admitted. "I don't want to live my life as a prisoner." Daniel nodded. "Then don't." Soraya let out a breathless laugh. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" Daniel asked. "You're not a prisoner, Soraya. You're a person. You get to choose." She looked away. "You don't know my father. He would never allow it." Daniel tilted his head. "Then leave." Soraya's breath caught in her throat. "Come with me," Daniel said, his voice softer now. "There's a ship leaving for Earth in 2 nights. I can get you on it." Soraya's heart pounded. Leave? Escape her home? It was madness. It was impossible. And yet, it was also the first time someone had given her a real option. She turned back to him, uncertainty in her eyes. "And if I don't?" Daniel's expression darkened. "Then your father will force you into a life you don't want, and I won't be able to stop him." Soraya swallowed hard. She had never been afraid of her father before, but now, for the first time, she realized she should be. A father's warning. The next morning, Soraya was summoned before the king. The throne room was filled with tension. King Zorath sat upon his high seat, his golden eyes burning with quiet fury. Beside him stood Warlord Koren. Soraya had never liked Koren. He was a man of war, a conqueror, his cold gaze fixed on her, as if she were nothing more than a possession. Her father spoke first. "You are to be married in 3 days." Soraya clenched her fists. "Father." "You will obey," Zorath interrupted, his voice sharp as steel, "or you will no longer be my daughter." Soraya's throat tightened. She looked at Corin, who smirked slightly, as if he had already won. Her father continued, "I know about the human." Soraya's blood turned cold. Zorath's expression was unreadable. "I have been patient, Soraya. But I will not tolerate betrayal. You will not see him again." Soraya forced herself to stay calm. "What will happen to him?" The king's gaze was hard. "He will be removed." Soraya's breath hitched. "You mean?" Zorath leaned forward. "A human is not worth my daughter's rebellion." Soraya felt rage rise inside her. How could her father speak of life so carelessly? How could he believe he had the right to decide her fate? She took a deep breath. "I will do as you ask." The king nodded. "Good." But as Soraya bowed her head and turned away, one thought burned inside her heart. She had made her decision. She would not stay. The escape plan. That night, Soraya found Daniel waiting for her in the royal gardens. "I'm in," she whispered. Daniel smiled slightly. "You're sure?" She nodded. "If I stay, my father will destroy everything I am. I won't let him." Daniel studied her face. "Then we need a plan." Soraya exhaled. "I know a way to the docking bays, but we only have 2 nights before the marriage ceremony." Daniel's smile faded. "Then we don't have much time." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their decision hanging between them. Then Daniel held out his hand. Soraya hesitated. Then, slowly, she took it. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what came next. She was ready. The night sky over Velthura was darker than usual, as if the universe itself held its breath. Princess Soraya stood on the balcony of her chambers, her heart pounding in her chest. She had made her choice. She was going to escape. For so long, she had obeyed every command, followed every rule, and lived the life her father had chosen for her, but not anymore. This was her moment. A soft knock at the door snapped her out of her thoughts. She turned quickly and saw Talia, her personal maid and most trusted friend. Talia stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "It's time," she whispered. Soraya took a deep breath. "Are the guards still watching the halls?" Talia nodded. "Yes, but I have prepared a distraction." Soraya's eyes softened. "You don't have to do this." Talia smiled. "You are my princess. I will always stand by you." Soraya squeezed her friend's hand. Then she grabbed a small bag containing only what she needed, nothing that could slow her down. "Let's go," she whispered. "The escape begins." The palace was silent, but Soraya knew that behind every corner, guards were waiting. She had no room for mistakes. Talia led her down a hidden hallway, one that only servants used. It was narrow and dark, but it was safe. For now. As they reached a small door leading to the lower courtyard, Talia stopped. "This is where I leave you," she said. Soraya froze. "You're not coming." Talia shook her head. "If I disappear, the king will know something is wrong. I need to stay here and buy you time." Soraya felt her chest tighten. "I don't want to leave you behind." Talia smiled softly. "Then don't let my efforts go to waste. Go, princess. Be free." Soraya nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. Then, with one last glance at her friend, she slipped through the door. Meeting Daniel. The night air was cool against her skin as Soraya moved through the gardens. She kept low, staying in the shadows, her heart racing with every step. If she was caught now, there would be no second chance. Ahead, near the stone fountain, a figure waited. Daniel Carter. He saw her and quickly stepped forward. "You made it." Soraya nodded, trying to catch her breath. "Barely." Daniel's expression turned serious. We don't have much time. The ship leaves in less than an hour. She looked at him, searching his face. Are you sure this is the right choice? Daniel met her gaze. Are you? Saraya took a deep breath. Yes, she was sure. Daniel grabbed her hand. Then let's go. A race against time. They moved quickly through the outer palace grounds, avoiding the patrols. Saraya led Daniel through a hidden pathway, one only she knew about. Everything was going well, too well. Then suddenly, halt. Saraya's heart stopped. Guards appeared from the shadows, blocking their path. Daniel pulled her behind him instinctively. His hand went to his side, but he had no weapon. He had come unarmed. To avoid suspicion, the lead guard stepped forward. Princess Saraya, your father demands your return. Saraya lifted her chin. I am leaving. The guard's expression hardened. Your place is here. Daniel spoke before she could. Maybe you should let her decide that. The guards drew their weapons. Daniel tensed, but Saraya stepped forward before a fight could break out. If you attack, my father will never forgive you for harming me, she said boldly. The guards hesitated. She was right. Taking advantage of their hesitation, Saraya grabbed Daniel's hand and ran. The guards shouted behind them, giving chase. A desperate escape. Saraya and Daniel raced through the dark streets of the Veltharian capital, dodging through narrow alleys and hidden paths. The docking bay was not far now, but the guards were closing in fast. Daniel glanced at Saraya. Can you keep running? She nodded, even though her legs were burning. I have to. Ahead, the human transport ship was already preparing for departure. We're almost there, Daniel shouted. But just as they reached the final stretch, another figure stepped into their path. Warlord Corin. The final confrontation. Corin was a towering figure, his armor gleaming under the lights. His expression was cold, unreadable. You are making a mistake, princess, he said. Saraya stood tall, despite her racing heart. The mistake was thinking I would ever belong to you. Corin's eyes darkened. I am offering you power. A future. Saraya steeled herself. A future I do not want. Corin exhaled. You would run away with a human, a man who has nothing to offer you. Daniel stepped forward. I offer her freedom. Corin's hand moved to his weapon. Then you will not leave. Saraya acted before she could think. She grabbed a nearby torch from the wall and swung it at Corin's face, forcing him back. Run, she shouted at Daniel. Daniel grabbed her hand, and together, they sprinted towards the ship. The guards were almost on them, but they leaped onto the boarding ramp just in time. As the engines roared to life, Saraya looked back one last time. Her father's palace stood in the distance. The life she had always known. The life she had left behind. Then the ship took off, racing towards the stars. The human transport ship soared through the vast expanse of space, leaving Velthera behind. The royal palace, the towering cities, the life Saraya had always known. All of it was now nothing more than a fading light in the distance. She stood by the viewing window, her golden eyes reflecting the endless stars. A heavy feeling sat in her chest. She had chosen this path, chosen freedom. But why did it still feel like a battle was waiting for her? Behind her, Daniel Carter approached quietly. You okay? He asked. Saraya nodded, though she wasn't sure if it was true. I should feel relieved. But I don't think my father will let this go so easily. Daniel exhaled. Yeah, I have a feeling you're right. The weight of her decision wasn't just personal anymore. By escaping, she had openly defied the king of Velthera, one of the most powerful rulers in the galaxy. There would be consequences. Saraya turned to Daniel. Do you regret this? He met her gaze. No, do you? She hesitated. Then, slowly, she shook her head. No. Before Daniel could say more, the ship's intercom crackled to life. Captain, we've got a problem. An unexpected threat. Daniel and Soraya rushed to the command deck, where the ship's captain, Lieutenant Hayes, was studying the radar. "What's wrong?" Daniel asked. Hayes pointed to the screen. "We've got an unidentified vessel on our tail. Fast, advanced, and coming straight for us." Soraya's stomach dropped. "Veltharian Royal Fleet." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Your father really didn't waste any time." Hayes glanced at Soraya. "Princess, if they catch us, they'll demand your return." Soraya's mind raced. Her father wouldn't just take her back. He would make sure she never got a second chance to escape. And Daniel, she didn't even want to think about what would happen to him. "We can't let them catch us," she said firmly. Hayes nodded. "We're already increasing speed, but they're faster." Daniel clenched his fists. "We need a plan." Betrayal in the midst. Just as they were about to discuss their options, an alarm blared across the ship. Unauthorized access detected in the engine room. Soraya's eyes widened. "What?" Without hesitation, she and Daniel rushed toward the lower decks, the sound of the alarm ringing in their ears. As they reached the engine room, they found a group of armed men, not humans, but Veltharian warriors in disguise. A trap. The realization hit Soraya like a punch to the stomach. One of the warriors, a Veltharian officer named Vexen, smirked at her. "Did you really think it would be this easy, Princess?" Soraya's hands curled into fists. "How did you get aboard?" Vexen chuckled. "You brought us here." Soraya's blood ran cold. One of the ship's crew members, someone she had trusted, had betrayed them. She turned her gaze toward the navigator, Ensign Grayson, who looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "You?" she whispered. Grayson shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sorry, Princess. Your father made me an offer I couldn't refuse." Daniel stepped in front of Soraya protectively. "You sold us out." Grayson looked at him with guilt. "It was never going to work, Carter. You really think you can outrun the Veltharian King?" Daniel's fists clenched, but before he could react, Vexen gave a command. "Seize them." The warriors moved forward. Daniel acted instantly. Grabbing a nearby metal pipe, he swung it hard, knocking one of the warriors back. Soraya followed his lead, using her training to fight, her movements quick and precise. The room exploded into chaos, but there were too many of them. Soraya dodged an attack, but before she could react, strong arms grabbed her from behind. She struggled, kicking and twisting, but the grip was too tight. Daniel fought hard, but he was outnumbered. A powerful blow to his side sent him crashing to the ground. As Soraya was dragged away, she screamed his name. "Daniel." Their eyes met for a split second, and then everything went dark. Captured. When Soraya awoke, she was no longer on the human ship. She was in a Veltharian royal prison cell, cold, metallic, and suffocating. She sat up, her heart pounding. How had this happened? They had been so close to freedom, and now she was right back where she started. Footsteps echoed through the halls. The door slid open, and there stood King Zoreth. Soraya's stomach twisted. Her father's face was unreadable, his golden eyes as sharp as ever. "You have embarrassed me," he said, his voice calm but filled with power. Soraya forced herself to sit tall. "I only did what I had to do." Zoreth stepped closer. "You think this is over?" He let out a slow breath. "You will return to your duties, and you will marry Warlord Corrin." Soraya's chest tightened with anger. "You can force me back, but you cannot control my heart." Her father's expression darkened. "Your heart is irrelevant. What matters is the kingdom." She glared at him. "Then maybe the kingdom is wrong." A dangerous silence filled the air. Finally, Zoreth spoke again, his voice quieter. "Do you know what your human companion is facing right now?" Soraya froze. Zoreth tilted his head. "He is being dealt with as we speak. Humans are fragile creatures, Soraya. Do not expect him to survive this." A wave of fear and rage crashed through her. She stood abruptly, her hands clenching at her sides. If you hurt him. Zoreth raised a hand, silencing her. You brought this on yourself. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Soraya alone in the cold darkness. Her breath was shaky, but inside, something burned like fire. She had lost once. She would not lose again. Soraya sat in the cold, dimly lit Veltharian prison cell, her heart pounding with anger and fear. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Do not expect him to survive this. She clenched her fists. Daniel was in danger. For most of her life, she had obeyed orders, followed rules, and accepted her fate. But not anymore. This time, she would fight. She stood and examined her surroundings. The cell was made of reinforced metal, with a single energy barrier blocking the exit. 2 guards stood outside, watching her closely. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to stay calm. There had to be a way out. Then, footsteps echoed through the corridor. The guards straightened, and Soraya turned to see a familiar figure step into view. Warlord Corin. He smirked, standing tall in his battle armor. Still defiant, I see. Soraya crossed her arms. What do you want, Corin? He chuckled. You should be grateful, Princess. Your father has given me full authority over this matter. He took a step closer. I will make this simple. If you agree to the marriage now, I will ensure your human survives. If you refuse, well, accidents happen. Soraya's blood boiled. You think I would ever agree to that? Corin sighed. I expected as much. He turned to the guards. Take her to the throne room. The king wishes to end this. The guards deactivated the energy barrier and grabbed her arms, pulling her forward. Soraya didn't fight back. Not yet. She needed to wait for the right moment. As they marched through the halls, she whispered a silent promise to herself. I will not let them win. Daniel struggled. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, Daniel Carter was barely holding on. His hands were tied behind his back, his body aching from the blows he had taken. He had fought hard when they captured him, but there were too many of them. Now he was in a dark chamber, surrounded by Gultharian warriors. One of them stepped forward. You should not have interfered, human. Daniel smirked, despite the pain. Yeah. Well, I have a bad habit of not listening to warnings. The warrior scowled and threw a punch to his stomach, making Daniel cough. But he wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about Soraya. He had to get out. He had to reach her. Just then, the sound of an explosion shook the palace. The warriors stumbled, looking around in shock. Daniel's eyes widened. Well, that's new. A moment later, the doors burst open, and a group of Veltharian rebels rushed in. The leader, a woman with sharp features, cut Daniel's restraints. Captain Carter, she said, Princess Soraya needs you. Daniel grinned, despite the pain. Then let's go. The throne room confrontation. Soraya was dragged into the massive throne room, where her father sat in his high seat, surrounded by his council. King Zoreth's golden eyes burned with disappointment. You have brought disgrace upon this kingdom, he said, but I will give you one last chance. Kneel. Accept your duty, and all will be forgiven. Soraya stood tall. You can take my title. You can take my home, but you will never take my will. The room fell silent. Her father's expression darkened. Then you leave me no choice. He raised his hand to give the order, when suddenly the doors burst open. Daniel stood there, bruised but unbroken. Gasps echoed through the room. The guards drew their weapons, but Daniel lifted a stolen Veltharian blaster and aimed it at the nearest one. Let her go, he said. Corin stepped forward, laughing. You are bold, human, but foolish. You are alone. Daniel smirked. Actually, I'm not. At that moment, a loud alarm blared as Veltharian rebels stormed the palace. They had waited for this moment, a sign of weakness from the king. Soraya saw her chance. She elbowed the guard holding her and grabbed a fallen weapon. Chaos erupted. The royal guards clashed with the rebels, and Soraya ran toward Daniel. He reached for her hand. "Let's end this." Together, they fought their way through the palace, dodging attacks and countering when necessary. Soraya turned to Daniel. "We need to get to the royal control room. If we shut down the security systems, the rebels will have the advantage." Daniel nodded. "Then let's move." The final stand. As they neared the control room, Corin blocked their path, his sword drawn. "You will not leave, Soraya." She lifted her chin. "You don't command me." Corin lunged. Soraya dodged, her movement swift. She had trained for battle all her life. But now, for the first time, she was fighting for herself. Daniel joined in, using his strength and quick thinking to counter Corin's attacks. The fight was intense, sparks flying as weapons clashed. Finally, Soraya saw an opening. She spun and disarmed Corin, pressing the blade to his throat. He glared at her. "Do it." She hesitated. "I am not like you." Then she turned and knocked him unconscious instead. Daniel grinned. "Nice move." Soraya smiled briefly. "Come on. We still have work to do." Victory and freedom. With the control room secured, Soraya shut down the palace defenses, allowing the rebels to take over. The battle was over. King Zoreth was forced to surrender. Soraya stood before him, unshaken. "Your rule is over, father." Zoreth exhaled. "And what will you do now, daughter?" She looked at Daniel, then back at her father. "I will live my own life." For the first time, Zoreth looked at her with something other than anger. Maybe even a trace of understanding. But it was too late for forgiveness. Soraya turned away, walking toward her future. Daniel smirked. "So, where to now, princess?" Soraya smiled. "Wherever we choose." Together, they stepped into the waiting ship, leaving the past behind. For the first time in her life, Soraya was truly free. The battle for freedom was over, but the weight of what had happened still lingered in the air. The royal palace of Velthera, once a symbol of power and control, now stood in silence. The Veltharian rebels had taken over, securing the throne room and the main gates. King Zoreth had surrendered, and his once loyal guards now stood down, unsure of their future. Princess Soraya, however, knew exactly what her future would be. She stood in the royal courtyard, staring at the palace one last time. This had been her home, a golden prison, filled with traditions and expectations that had never been hers to choose. Now she was walking away from it all. Daniel Carter stood beside her, his uniform still marked with dust and battle scars. He glanced at her. "So, what now?" Soraya took a deep breath, feeling the cool air of freedom for the first time. "We leave." Daniel smirked. "Just like that?" She turned to him, her golden eyes shining. "Yes, just like that." A kingdom without a princess. King Zoreth sat in the dimly lit throne room, his face unreadable. The power he once commanded was now slipping away. The council members whispered among themselves, uncertain of what was to come. One of the noble advisors, Lord Vale, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, we must restore order. The rebels will not stop here. We need the princess to return." Zoreth's golden eyes flickered toward the door, where Soraya had disappeared only minutes ago. "She is no longer part of this kingdom," the king said slowly. The council gasped. "But..." He raised a hand, silencing them. "She has made her choice." The room fell into a stunned silence. For the first time, King Zoreth had allowed something he had never permitted before, his daughter's freedom. Aboard the starship, the hum of the engine filled the small transport ship as it soared away from Velthera. Soraya sat near the viewing window, watching as her homeworld shrank into the distance. Daniel walked over, handing her a warm cup of Earth-style tea. "You okay?" Soraya took the cup, holding it between her hands. "It feels strange," she admitted. "I have spent my entire life preparing to rule a kingdom. Now, I am no one." Daniel leaned against the wall, smirking. "You're not no one. You're Soraya, A woman who just defied a king, led a rebellion, and punched a warlord in the face. Soraya chuckled softly. I suppose that does sound impressive. Daniel took a sip of his drink. So, where do we go now? She thought for a moment. Earth. I want to see the world you spoke about. I want to experience a life without rules. Daniel nodded. Earth it is. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both knowing that their journey was just beginning. Then, Daniel turned to her. Soraya. She looked at him. Yes. He hesitated for a second before speaking. If you had to do it all over again, leaving Velthera, standing against your father, would you still choose this? Soraya gazed at him, then at the stars outside the window. A small smile formed on her lips. I would choose this every time. A message from the king. Just as they were settling into the ship, the communication panel beeped. A message. Daniel frowned and pressed the screen. A hologram of King Zoreth appeared. Soraya stiffened. Father. Zoreth's gaze was unreadable, his usual authority still present, but something about him seemed different, less rigid. You have won your freedom, he said. And though you have turned your back on this kingdom, you are still my daughter. Soraya's breath caught in her throat. She had expected anger. Not this. Zoreth continued, his voice calm. The throne will remain in Veltharian hands, but if ever you should wish to return, the doors will not be closed to you. Soraya felt tears sting her eyes. It was not a full acceptance of her choices, but it was more than she had ever hoped for. Daniel glanced at her, letting her process the words. Finally, she stood tall, looking at the hologram. Thank you, Father, but I have found my own path. Zoreth's gaze softened for the briefest moment. Then the hologram faded away. Soraya exhaled, letting go of the last ties to her past. Daniel smirked. That was unexpected. Soraya chuckled. Everything about this journey has been unexpected. The beginning of something new. As the ship jumped into hyperspace, Soraya looked at Daniel and smiled. She had given up a throne, a kingdom, and a life of certainty. But in return, she had gained something far greater: freedom, adventure, and the chance to truly live. And as Daniel sat beside her, she realized something else. She had also found love. A love that was worth more than 1,000 crowns. A love that no king, no kingdom, and no warlord could ever take away. The stars stretched before them, endless and full of possibility. And for the first time in her life, Soraya was excited to see where the future would take her.